Hi everybody, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is the case against monopoly. Now, to build that case, we need to take a look at efficiency, something we've talked about before in this class. You're also going to see that there's some content in this lecture that's familiar to you already because we've already touched on some of these topics. But by putting it in one lecture and, of course, adding on to what you've already learned, I think it will make the case far more intuitive. So again, the case against monopoly. Let's begin. When we think about efficiency, there are really two types of efficiency we look at when we're evaluating firm behavior. So we're going to start by taking a look at these two types of efficiency. The first is called productive efficiency. And productive efficiency is actually the easier of the two concepts. I think you're going to find it very intuitive. We're basically asking if the firm is producing at its minimum cost, right? To be efficient, you should be able to deliver a product at a minimum cost. So that's what we need to look at. Is the firm producing at its minimum cost? If they're not, then that means costs are higher than they would be otherwise. So are you producing at your minimum cost? And if you're not, that means your costs are higher than they'd be otherwise. Well, clearly that's not good for you and me as consumers. So are you producing at minimum cost? So again, we clearly want firms to produce at the lowest possible cost. So we're going to take a look in just a second. For us to define productive efficiency, for us to look at a graph, we have to require that the firm be operating at the minimum of its average total cost curve. Now you understand what that means, the minimum of its average total cost curve. So if you're at the minimum of your average total cost curve, then you're clearly minimizing costs as much as possible. And again, if you're not at this minimum of your average total cost, then your average total cost of production is higher than it could be. So again, are you at that minimum point of your average total cost? And if not, then you're producing at some other point where average total cost is higher. So obviously what we want as consumers is for the firm to operate at an output that puts it on the minimum of average total cost. So that's what we're looking to see. Is the firm operating at an output that puts it at the minimum of its average total cost? And again, that's what's best for you and me as consumers. If a firm is not producing at the output level that puts it at the minimum of average total cost, then we would say they're productively inefficient. So you're either productively efficient because you're at the minimum of average total cost, or you're productively inefficient. You're not at the minimum of average total cost. So as I said, this is a pretty straightforward thing for us to see on the graph. Now, the equation that explains productive efficiency is also simple, and it's not really even an equation. It simply says we need to be at a Q where we're at minimum average total cost. So I think I've beaten that horse to death. I've said it over and over again. We're simply going to say that our criteria, our condition is you're at an output Q where you're at the minimum of average total cost. So let's evaluate productive efficiency for both a perfectly competitive firm and also for a monopoly. And so we're going to take a look at graphs, and you'll be able to very quickly determine if firms are productively inefficient or if they're productively inefficient. Now, one thing I want to point out is that efficiency is generally a long-run concept. When we evaluate efficiency, we're usually looking at long-run graphs. And so when we look at monopoly and when we look at perfect competition, we need to be looking at the long-run version of graphs. Okay? Let's get started. Now, on the left, you see a competitive firm, and do you agree with me that we're in the long run, right? This is our long run equilibrium condition. Now, how do I know that it's the long run equilibrium condition? Because we see here zero economic profits. And this should be review by now. But let's just make sure you remember zero economic profits. Take your finger and make sure you can find the box that's total revenue. So it's under the green line to the left of the yellow line. And then find the box that represents total cost. And you should see that our total revenue box and our total cost box are one and the same, zero economic profits. Now also remember, does zero economic profits mean you're broke? No, it simply means you're doing exactly as well as your next best alternative. In other words, $80,000 in accounting profits, $80,000 in opportunity costs. That gives you zero economic profits. Okay, enough review. So we're looking at this graph and we see that we have zero economic profits. Agreed? Yes. So is this firm operating at an output that puts it at minimum of its average total cost curve? Take a second look at the graph. Are they operating at their minimum average total cost? Well, look at the point where the firm is operating. They're operating right there at Q star, and I've got my pink arrow that's pointed to the intersection. And do we agree? Yes, this firm is operating on its minimum average total cost, so yes, it is productively efficient. So what we've just learned is competitive firms are productively efficient. But what about a monopolist? So the graph on the left shows a monopoly. And in this graph right here, we see the monopolist making supernormal profits, right? We're making supernormal profits. You see the supernormal profits in that light tan color. Well, don't forget, monopolies don't have entry like in perfect competition, right? One of our assumptions in the model of monopoly is high barriers to entry. So if there are very high or strong barriers to entry, that means when you're making supernormal profits, others can't enter, right? So what that means is a monopolist can make economic profits that are greater than zero, in other words, supernormal profits, in the short run and the long run. So we don't have to make the same distinction as with perfect competition. So if this monopolist made supernormal profits in the short run, they would likely make those same supernormal profits in the long run because nobody can enter and compete those supernormal profits away. All right, again, that should be review as well, but I want to make sure you understand that point. Let's ask the same question. Is this firm, the monopolist, operating in an output that puts it at the minimum of average total cost? Take a second and decide. Well, no. What we see is that it's at a lower output than being at minimum average total cost, right? This monopolist is operating at Q1, but that's not where average total costs are minimized. So the pink arrow shows us where the monopolist is operating, but what do you know? Minimum average total cost is going to be to the right, right? Where marginal cost cuts through. So what that tells us is that average total costs would decrease, maybe just a little bit in this graph, but they would decrease if the firm produced more output. So what that tells us then, since this firm is not at the minimum of average total cost is minimized somewhere at a higher output level to the right, that tells us that this firm is productively inefficient. So let's think for a second. What did we learn about perfectly competitive firms? They were productively efficient, but the monopoly is not. All right, part of our case against the monopoly. A second type of efficiency that we look at is called allocative efficiency. Now, this is not hard, but it's a little bit harder to get your brain around. When we think of allocative efficiency, we're talking about addressing the optimal allocation of resources. So this is about allocation of resources, and we want them to be optimal. In other words, we don't want to put resources into activities that society doesn't value. If we put resources into activities that society doesn't value, that would be a waste. So again, we don't want to put resources into activities that society does not value. Because again, that would be a waste and that would be inefficient. Remember what we mean when we talk about efficiency. Efficiency requires that we allocate resources to where they are most highly valued, right? We want resources to be allocated to where they're most highly valued. That's the efficient use of those resources. Now, allocative efficiency can be thought of as a marginal cost versus marginal benefit story. And as I've said many times, I know I sound like a broken record, but much of what we do in this class is some version of marginal cost, marginal benefit. Well, here's another example. Let's say we're producing widgets, and it doesn't even matter what a widget is, but for whatever reason, our society produces widgets. So we want to think about society's marginal benefits for widgets, and we want to compare that to the marginal cost of producing widgets. So we want to think about society's marginal benefit for widgets, and we want to compare that to the marginal cost of producing those widgets. So again, we're making a marginal benefit, marginal cost comparison. Now, if society's marginal benefits of widgets is greater than the marginal cost of widgets, then society would be better off with more. We want more widgets. So when marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, we want more. If instead society's marginal benefits are less than marginal cost, well then we want less. We've overproduced. So again, we're comparing marginal benefit and marginal cost, but we're doing it from society's perspective. Therefore, we can determine that the optimal level of widgets in society is to allocate resources to the point where marginal benefit exactly equals marginal cost of widgets. That's what the best situation is. So the best level of widgets, the optimal level of widgets in society is to allocate enough resources so we can produce where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. All right, I know you understand that. That's a simple story. Again, we're thinking about marginal benefit and marginal cost of widgets from society's perspective. From society's perspective. So at the beginning of the semester, we did something very simple. We did things like optimal number of slices of pizza to eat for one person, Brad. All we're doing is taking that same model and expanding it to society. But now we need to make one change when we're looking at society. The marginal benefit that society places on widgets is captured in price. So I don't need to call it marginal benefit. I can simply look at price, right? The price that the market determines we should pay for widgets reflects society's marginal benefits. That's our marginal value of widgets. So then what we really need to do is compare price versus marginal cost, right? Price instead of marginal benefit. So all I'm doing is making one substitution, Before we talked about marginal benefit versus marginal cost, and now we're going to look at price versus marginal cost. Therefore, the criteria for allocative efficiency is simply price equals marginal cost, right? It's a version of marginal benefit equals marginal cost, but it's going to be price equals marginal cost. So all we've done is substituted in price for marginal benefit. All right, that's easy. This is an easy concept as well. So again, the optimal amount of widgets to produce is going to be where price equals marginal cost. And again, that's from society's perspective, not necessarily the firm's perspective. And it's important that you note that this is society's perspective, because what we're going to find is the monopoly doesn't want to do that. So this isn't what's best for the firm, it's what's best for society. So again, if price is greater than marginal cost, then that would be like saying marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, and we'd want to increase output. That's going to be very relevant in just a moment. Okay, hope you're with me. So we're back to the model of perfect competition. And again, we agree that we've got a graph of perfect competition, a firm in perfect competition in the long run. And we know it's the long run. Why? Because we have zero economic profits. All right, we get that. So is this firm operating at an output that sets price equal to marginal cost? Take a look. What do you think? Is price equal to marginal cost here? Well, the firm is operating at Q star, right? Which means they're operating where my pink arrow is pointing. And so that's where we need to focus. Do you agree price this firm is going to charge is $2? And we see that because that's where the green demand curve is. I don't have it labeled, but you should know at this point, right, that wherever that green demand curve is, that's the price because they're price takers. So price is $2. And do you also agree that marginal cost is $2? Because if I take my finger and put it on Q star, if you're not clear, take your finger and put it on Q star and go up the yellow line and see where you are on the marginal cost curve. You're at the black dot, and if you go to the left to measure it, you're going to see marginal cost is also $2. So do we have price equal to marginal cost here in the model of perfect competition? We do. So we would say that this firm is allocatively efficient. This firm is allocatively efficient. But what about the monopolist? Let's take a look. So here we have a monopolist, and we want to know, is this firm setting a price equal to marginal cost? We saw it in perfect competition, but is the same going to be true in a monopoly? In other words, are they operating at an output that puts it, oops, my bad, ignore that bullet right there, I'm so sorry. Just cross that off if it's on your slide. So, I should have deleted it. So take a look, price is P1, everyone agree? Price is P1. And where's marginal cost? I'm about to put an arrow up to show you, but take your finger and make sure you can find marginal cost here. Again, how do I do that? Take your finger and put it on Q1 and go up to the marginal cost curve and over. And I've even got it labeled for you with that red dotted line. So everyone agree, right where that pink arrow is, that's marginal cost. So what do you think? Is price equal to marginal cost? No. Do we agree price is significantly greater than marginal cost? Again, in class, we talked about the markup. We talked about the fact that the monopolist is not a marginal cost pricer. The monopolist is going to mark its price up well above marginal cost. So we would say that this firm is allocatively inefficient. So again, let's reflect on what we've learned. The competitive firm, were they allocatively efficient? Yeah, they were. Is the monopolist allocatively efficient? No, they're not. Second case or strike against the monopolist, right? So again, we're adding on to our case against the monopolist. Remember the idea that we talked about in class called contrived scarcity. What we meant by contrived scarcity was that the monopolists produced less than a competitive firm. So the monopolist here is producing Q1, but a competitive firm, a competitive industry rather, is going to produce more. And in this case, society would be better off with more. Everyone agree? Price is greater than marginal cost. When price is greater than marginal cost, it means our value is greater than the marginal cost of producing this. So if our value is greater than the marginal cost of producing, we should produce more. But the monopolists are not going to produce more than Q1. Q1 is the profit maximizing or loss minimizing, but in this case, profit maximizing output level. The firm maximizes its profits at Q1. If it produces more, it's not going to maximize profits. So the monopolist doesn't care that it's not being allocatively efficient, but society should care. There's one last topic to address here. And this is one we may have already covered in class, but it's worth a good review. And probably if we covered it in class, we did it quickly. So this is important to pay attention to. We want to look at the impact on consumer and producer surplus. The impact on consumer and producer surplus. In other words, we want to compare consumer surplus and producer surplus for a monopoly to what we see in a competitive market. So we want to compare consumer and producer surplus for a monopoly to what we see in the competitive market. And we're going to see that there are some differences in consumer and producer surplus. All right. So here we've got a graph of a monopolist, but don't let this confuse you. See the note in green. In this graph, it's being drawn with an upward sloping marginal cost curve. It could be hook-shaped as well. Don't let that worry you. Nothing else changes. But other than that, it looks like our monopolist. Let's make sure we see that. We have our downward sloping demand curve, and we have our dotted purple marginal revenue curve, and we've got an upward sloping marginal cost curve. It's just not hook-shaped. So the graph is a little confusing, but really it's the same as what we've done in class. Now, in class, we determined that the monopolist would price its product at PM, right? PM is going to be the monopolist price. And we said that QM will be its output. So the monopolist, when it profit maximizes, remember the shortcut rule, they're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Dotted line goes through there. Set output at QM, go up to the demand curve and over to get price, PM. All right, that should be review. Now, when we have this situation, do you agree consumer surplus is equal to area A? It's yellow, right? So area A in yellow reflects consumer surplus. That's what consumers are willing to pay in excess of what they have to pay, right? They're going to be asked to pay price PM, but they're willing to pay up to the height of their demand curves. So consumers get A. Now producers are getting B plus D. Producer surplus is in orange. Remember, producer surplus is the difference between what they're going to be paid which is PM, and their marginal cost curve. So orange is basically capturing all those marginal profits because their marginal costs are from the blue line, but they're getting PM from consumers. So B plus D is the producer surplus. And again, it stops at QM because they're only producing QM. So we see basically the total economic pie. A goes to consumers, B goes to producers, D goes to producers. Now, let's force the firm to act competitively. We did this in class. When we say we're going to force the firm to act competitively, what we mean by that is we're going to require them to be a marginal cost pricer, right? Because competitive firms are marginal cost pricers. So if we require them to be a marginal cost pricer, then they must set their price at marginal cost. They have to set their price at marginal cost. Now remember, price comes from the demand curve, and of course we have a marginal cost curve. So what we're going to do then is force them to operate at the intersection of demand and marginal cost. And so when we intersect demand and marginal cost, we get price equals marginal cost. So I've just put in a pink arrow. Everyone agree? That's the point, that intersection right there, where price coming from the demand curve equals marginal cost. So when this monopolist has to act as a competitive firm, they're going to set their price equal to PC. And they're going to set their output equal to QC. So now we can take a look at consumer and producer surplus. And I've got PC and QC labeled in my red dotted lines. Now, what we're going to see is that the monopolist, or what we have seen, is that the monopolist behaves really differently than a competitive firm. So again, before we talk about consumer and producer surpluses, let's make sure we understand. A monopolist charges PM, but when forced to act as a marginal cost pricer, as a competitive firm, they're going to charge PC. So what does that tell us? Monopolists raise their price over competitive prices. And the monopolist will set their output at QM. But when forced to be competitive, they're going to set output at QC. So what does that tell us? Monopolists decrease output. That's the idea of contrived scarcity that we've been talking about. Monopolists produce an artificially low level of output at an elevated price. So as we said, competition has lower prices and competition increases output. They have higher output. All right, we get that. Now let's look at consumer and producer surplus. So when this monopolist is acting as a competitive firm, that's important to keep saying, when we're forcing them to behave competitively, we see consumer and producer surplus are going to be different than when they act as a monopolist. Consumer surplus at this lower price, does everyone agree it's going to be A, B, and C? It's going to be that whole triangle above the red dotted line. A plus B plus C. And producer surplus, remember, it's going to be the difference between marginal cost and price. Producer surplus is D plus E. So we're seeing very different consumer and producer surplus. Now in a second, I'm going to put it all on one side so we can compare. But just take a second, make sure that you're following me. All right. So again, for the monopoly, consumer surplus was A, producer surplus was B plus D, because contrived scarcity limits output to QM. But when acting as a competitive firm under competition, if they have to mimic competition, consumer surplus is A plus B plus C, and producer surplus is D plus E. Okay, so take a look. Compare consumers. Where are consumers better off? Are consumers better off when we have goods produced with a monopoly? Or are consumers better off when we have goods produced under competitive environments? Well, hopefully you see consumers are better off with competition, right? They capture more consumer surplus. In both cases, they get A, but under a competitive arrangement, they also get B plus C because price is lower and more is produced. But what about producers? Are producers better under monopoly, or are they better off under competition? Well, hopefully you can see that producers are better off with monopoly, right? Producers don't want competition, they want monopoly. In both cases, they get area D. But as a monopolist, they capture B, but not E. And as a competitive firm, they capture E, but not B. So again, it's not as striking as the difference for consumers, but here we see that firms would be a little better off as monopolists. But it's clear that consumers are worse off when it's a monopolist. All right. So now let's think about what's going on. Let's start at competition and move to monopoly. And hopefully you see if we started in competition and we move to monopoly, something happens to areas C and E. Well, what happens? Where did C and E go? They existed under competition. Consumers got C, producers got E, but under monopoly, they completely disappear, right? They completely disappear. Because again, the monopolist is only producing QM. We call this area C plus E, the dead weight loss. So that gray triangle to the right of QM is dead weight loss. It's area that simply disappeared. When we talk about dead weight loss, what we see is basically a shrinking of the economic pie. We're basically seeing a shrinking of the economic pie. The pie doesn't matter how it's divided between producers and consumers, but the pie gets smaller. There's less divide up. So it's basically consumer surplus and producer surplus that has simply disappeared. Again, shrinking of the pie, consumer surplus and producer surplus that has simply disappeared. Where did it come from? Remember, it comes from contrived scarcity. It comes from the idea of contrived scarcity. Oh, hang on a second. Hold on, I'll call you back in 1 minute. Bye. Sorry about that. Professor Sanchez. As a result of contrived scarcity, what we're seeing again is output shrink. So as output shrinks, that consumer surplus and that producer surplus that were being generated simply goes away. It's important to understand that this really means that there are transactions that would benefit society There are transactions that would benefit society, but these transactions between consumers and producers aren't going to occur. So what I mean by that is there might be, producers that if they produced an additional widget could sell the widget and make some money, and everyone would be happy. It'd be a win-win. That transaction's not going to occur because of contrived scarcity. So clearly, deadweight loss reduces social well-being. As a society, our well-being is decreased when we have deadweight losses. Now we're starting to get a sense of the case against monopoly, right? And there's a lot of things that we can point to in this case against monopoly. So let's quickly review the things that we can point to in our case against monopoly. First, we can look at price, the monopolist's price versus the competitive price. What did we learn? Who has the higher price? The monopolist, right? And we can point to output. We can look at the monopolist's output versus the competitive market's output. And again, I'm not talking about competitive firms, I'm talking about the market. Again, who produces more and who produces less? Well, with monopolists, we learned about contrived scarcity. Artificial scarcity is being created by the monopolist. We talked about productive efficiency. I'm sorry, a little typo there. Productive efficiency. We talked about allocative efficiency. So go back and make sure you can answer those questions. Who's productively efficient? Who's allocatively efficient? And who's inefficient? And then finally, we just talked about deadweight loss. And so deadweight losses shrink the economic pie, and that's bad as well. So we have to ask ourselves a question as consumers. Are we better off when goods and services are produced by a monopoly? Or are we better off when markets are competitive? Well, after everything we just learned, hopefully this answer is very, very clear to you. Generally, you and I are better off with competitive markets. And as I may have said in class, that's why there's regulations that limit monopolies. You can't simply be an outright monopoly. Now, you've got some latitude, but if a firm has too much monopoly power, we might decide we have to split them up. And that happened with, Western Bell, I think it was, years and years and years ago, long before you were born. The phone company was a monopoly, and the government basically made them divest and split into multiple companies called the baby bells, we called them, and they had to compete against each other. So we're better off with competitive markets. However, it would be a big omission if I didn't note that monopolies can have their role. So I've kind of characterized monopolies as being completely bad, but we do want to acknowledge there are some things that might be important about monopolies. First of all, monopolies might be a good source of innovation. Monopolies might be a good source of innovation. As an example, let's think about a pharmaceutical company, and they invent a new drug and they get a patent. So a company invents a new drug and they get a patent. And do we agree that when they have that patent and nobody else can produce that drug, they'll be a monopoly? Well, if they didn't have the ability to be a monopoly, would they have produced that drug? Maybe not, right? If they weren't protected from competition, that drug may never have come into being. But society may be better off with the drug. I mean, imagine if some pharmaceutical company finds the cure to cancer. Well, if they're not protected from competition, they are not going to invest in that kind of research. It wouldn't be prudent. It wouldn't be economical. So sometimes we see monopolies as being good sources of innovation. And we can't forget the natural monopoly. which we likely have already talked about in class. And I gave some examples, most likely electric utilities or local cable companies. They're both examples of local monopolies. Well, let's think about the situation with these kinds of firms. We might be better off having just one firm as opposed to three. So imagine if there were three different cable companies. So in Farmville, Virginia, we have one cable company. And let's imagine if there were three cable companies. How would the world look? Well, first, they'd all have to lay cable lines all over town. Three companies would be doing the exact same thing, laying the cables all over town, which means they'd all have to incur a very large fixed cost, right? The fixed cost associated with laying cables would be huge. But each of the cable companies has approximately a third of the market, right? So if each of them have only a third of the market, they'd have fewer people to divide these fixed costs over. If there's only one firm, they can divide these large fixed costs across all of their customers. But if they have only 1/3 of the market, that's much fewer people to divide the cost over. And that would mean, folks, that we'd pay more for cable, right? So probably one cable company in Farmville is better than two or three. So in this case, monopolies can be a good thing, right? Natural monopolies would be where monopolies are good. And by the way, I should have added something about economies of scale, which I'm sure we've talked about in class. But make sure that you understand the idea of economies of scale. Economies of scale was the idea that as firms got bigger, average costs fell. So as our cable company gets bigger, average costs go down, and that's good for you and me. So monopolies can be a source of innovation, and in some few instances, we see monopolies which are actually good for us, the natural monopoly. So that wraps up our discussion, the case against monopoly. Make sure you understand this content, and let me know, of course, if you have any questions. Thanks for listening and have a great day.